One of the best single-player games of last generation is up for grabs if you act fast. Hey, it's Game Rant, and Epic Game Store is giving away a 2014 Game of the Year winner for free. And the game in question is none other than Dragon Age Inquisition Game of the Year Edition, and despite being a 2014 game, is the latest in the much-loved Dragon Age series. If you jump onto the Epic Store between May 16th to May 23rd, which of course requires a free account, you are adding it to a digital library after all, but this is also the best version of the game, which includes Jaws of Hakan, The Descent, and Trespasser, which are all very ominous-sounding nouns. Dragon Age Inquisition was widely acclaimed upon release, much to the dismay of the developers. We'll circle back to that confusing statement in just a bit. Dragon Age Inquisition won Game of the Year at the 2014 Game Awards and the 18th Annual DICE Awards, essentially winning the hearts of critics and their fellow developers. This came from the storied RPG developer BioWare, who had already perfected their dialogue-driven storylines with Mass Effect Trilogy and the previous Dragon Age games. Inquisition was far more liberated, as it is a standalone game, and the decisions you make feel completed by the time the story is done. So when we say this is a full experience, we mean full experience. The story itself is certainly good, if not a bit familiar with its fantasy tropes, but much like Mass Effect, it's the characters that ultimately make the greater narrative work. An event itself may not feel very significant until one of your allies steps up with a conflicting viewpoint, and before you know it, you're weighing out the options as to not offend your battle-forged friend. The game also received a special award from GLAD for its inclusion of LGBTQ+ characters. You've not lived until you partied with Ironball. And to be clear, this is not a large wall of text narrative. It's the people you meet and befriend along the way. But this game is infamous when it comes to the development community. As retold in Jason Schreier's 2017 book, Blood, Sweat, and Pixels, the triumphant, turbulent story behind how video games are made, the team at BioWare were blindsided by Electronic Arts' shift to in-house engines rather than licensing out familiar alternatives such as Unreal Engine. This was a popular concept by major publishers at the time to compete with Epic Games in the field of licensed engines. EA's Frostbite Engine 3 had been developed by DICE for their Battlefield series, and worked well for the first-person shooter multiplayer warfare. But it's one thing to be the company that makes the engine, and it's another trying to learn said engine. And by all accounts, BioWare employees despised working with Frostbite 3 for its third-person role-playing game, as its priorities would require advanced optimization, creating even more work for the BioWare employees who were trapped in realizing their ambitious plans while combating an unfamiliar engine that had never been given such a concept quite like this, which of course meant long crunch hours. This is where the game's most audacious anecdote comes from. The developers were constantly overruled and burnt out, to the point where the developers, as committed as they were to their own work, hoped the game would fail critically and financially, not as some sort of revenge, but to highlight this sort of treatment ultimately results in bad games, even when they met the standards set before them by Electronic Arts. In recent years, the writer and co-creator of Inquisition went so far as to say that if these sorts of practices continue, maybe the video game industry as it is deserves to die. Which is to say, despite being a success story in the system, the first-hand accounts from developers have demystified any sort of system, claiming they were the source of the game's quality and that they had been harshly overworked to meet milestones faster. In fact, it was a shock to them that Dragon Age Inquisition began scooping up awards. Some worried it would begin setting a precedent going forward. And this is when the details began being leaked to the press. Again, this is not to dismiss the quality of the game, which is undeniable. It's a game whose backstory is as fascinating as the game itself. So if you've never given it a shot and have yourself an Epic Store account, you can explore one of the strangest yet most successful AAA games of last generation. And we haven't even talked about the versatile combat system, or the surprisingly good graphics for a 10-year-old game system. It's probably that Frostbite engine. Ugh. Let's move on. Plus, it will get you hyped for Dreadwolf, the next Dragon Age game. How's the development going on that game? We have no idea. But if history is anything to show us, we'll probably hear about it in the near future. Which is why you should keep clicking around here on Game Rant. We're always updating the news, including BioWare and EA. So, we'll see you next time.